So, welcome to the second edition of the research. No, what is it? Religious Studies Collective
Yes, that's right.
um, podcast. Let's say video recording as well. So, however you happen to be viewing or listening to this, as appropriate. Look, I'm joined by Milad Milani. I mean, the difference is this time, but last time around, if you happen to see the first episode, Milad I was joining Milad. Um, so we're doing a role reversal essentially for these first two sessions. Milad was gracious enough to invite me to talk about my most recent book, but now quid pro quo, I'm going to talk about Milad's most recent book. I don't know if that is actually showing on the thing within the frame of the camera, but Milad's most recent book, just entitled Heidegger Ontology and the Destiny of Islam, subtitled Thoughts and Reflections on the Nature of Islam in the World. Subtitle, I think, is excellently descriptive. The use of the word reflections in there is very important to describe what's happening in this book. As I was just saying to Milad, there's an enormous amount going on here, and certainly more than we're going to be able to exhaust in this discussion, but it's great to have such a rich volume to guide us and give us lots of points of potential jumping off. Milad, I suppose I should introduce, although I don't think he needs an introduction, but Milad Milani teaches Islamic studies, I think it's fair to say, at Western Sydney, and is known, I think, principally, it would be fair to say, Milad, and maybe this can begin our discussion in the way, for your work on Sufism. I think most of your publications are very explicitly focused on Sufism. And I guess this is your first major publication that is not. In fact, Sufism is only mentioned quite briefly, I think, in this book. Actually, it's a book about Islam as a whole, which is a very daunting topic to take on. But you really grasp the nettle here. I'm tempted to ask you about the relationship to Sufism here, because you don't address it in the book. I mean, this is like an unfair thing for me to want to ask. I have a whole bunch of unfair questions in my mind. The questions that are like, well, and you can always ask these questions because there's always an infinite number of things someone doesn't talk about, but there's a bunch of things you don't talk about here that I'm interested how it relates. Because I think, it's not that there's a kind of Sufi orientation in this book, but I feel like, in a certain sense, your reading of Islam tends in that direction. So it's not rigorously, of course, the figure you're using here to discuss Islam. Sorry, I'm talking so much. Is the, like, perhaps slightly surprising figure of Martin Heidegger. And we're going to have to say, I think, a little bit about Heidegger. I'm assuming, any audience we have will know what Islam is, at least. If not, that might be a bit of a difficult conversation for you to get into. But I can't assume the same thing for listeners, viewers, about Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger is certainly a well-known figure in recent European philosophy, but, we're doing religious studies here. Not everyone will know of him. Of course, his influence on theology in particular, and Christian theology, has been very significant. But something you talk about here is that he has had a really significant influence in, I don't know what you'd say, Islamic studies, but not quite that. I guess Islamic theology, you would say. Is that fair to say? That, I mean, it's not like a totally eccentric thing for you to bring Heidegger into contact with Islam. That this has been done by figures within Islam now, going back the best part of a century. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair. Mark, thanks so much for that wonderful leading, and you're very gracious to say those things. Especially the fact that you sort of mentioned that you're picking up on the unsaid aspects of the book, and I was kind of hoping for that in a way. So many things are left out, I guess deliberately, because I wanted the book, as I say in the introduction, for it to be reflective, kind of like makes you kind of wonder about things necessarily, not this kind of format that we're usually used to writing, sort of transparent and clear, and sort of spelling out things always. So I've deviated from the normal academic path a little bit here, and you know, my confession is that it's a little bit experimental in that sense. So, and it is indeed, as you say, a book that moves away from my area of expertise. So it makes me feel a little bit more vulnerable. I feel like I'm, you know, in a way out of my comfort zone. Um, and of course, it also does this other difficult task by bringing in Martin Heidegger. As you say, however, it's fair, and Martin Heidegger is I'm not the first to do it. Martin Heidegger is an incredibly significant figure to um, Islamic intellectual history, Islamic thought, its tradition as it developed from the 20th century, probably from just before the early half of the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, or at least from at least the middle of the 20th century up until the present time. There's a great deal of engagement with Heidegger, and there's indeed a revival of Heidegger studies in the Islamicate world. Now, I use that word Islamicate deliberately here because, in my mentioning it now, because I would only contest the notion of Islamic theology. Theology is not the notion of Islamic theology. Let me walk that back. I contest theology as a phenomenon within the world of Islamic thought, and I think that needs to be unpacked and discussed. But having said that, the Islamicate world, which includes intellectuals, thinkers of great significance, who are not necessarily Muslim, but Muslim also among them, who have thought deeply and utilized Heidegger for the purposes of doing similar things. For instance, raising the question of being, or readdressing certain issues within cultural assumptions, theological assumptions, metaphysical assumptions, and so on and so forth. So language becomes essentially significant for their work and in the way that it carries certain assumptions. And so they use Heideggerian tools to sort of unpack these, tackle these, and so on. Is that,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. I mean, yeah, I've got to apologize, I guess, using the word theology, partly because,
Oh,
as you
no.
point out, it's kind of contested in this
Mm.
context, but also because, of course, for Heidegger, theology is kind of a pejorative term. Well, perhaps that's not quite right, but
Mhm.
we need to be very careful where we use it, let's
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
And I mean, his a big bugbear for him is theology getting mixed in with ontology, which is the second
Yeah.
word in your book.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I want to. I mean, if you perhaps you want to talk about Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, but I think probably it's best if I dial it back a little bit
Yeah.
and just ask about how the Heideggerian approach works in the book. And I mean, I really think what's brilliant about the use of Heidegger here is the way you use Heidegger to resist all the obvious approaches to the object of Islam, right? So, Islam is the analytical object in the book, and with through Heidegger, you're able to refuse to take all the normal approaches, which we're kind of very used to, kind of
Mm.
Islam is violent or Islam is peaceful, or
Yeah.
and the standard approaches, which on the one hand, there's and this I think is equally true from a Muslim or Islamicate point of view and a kind of Western point of view, looking at Islam, that people look at Islam and they will look at, okay, they'll say, okay, so we need to just look at the Quran and that will determine what Islam is, or we will look at the history and that will determine, or we'll have some naturalistic view that will have like a materialist account of where it comes from. But through Heidegger, you're able to resist all of those and ask a different question. I take it, the way you determine this conceptually is to say, it's about the being in the world of Islam, is this Heideggerian phrase. And that, I mean, means it's about, I take it from a Heideggerian perspective, this idea of an orientation towards the question of being, right? So, I mean, for Heidegger, different cultures differ in the way they approach this question of being, right? That this is fair to say that all human beings are faced with the question of being.
Mhm.
What is being, or what is it to
Yeah.
be? And but different cultures come to different answers. So, but Islam is for you, it's a kind of
Mm.
it's a specific approach, but of course, it's a specific approach that's defined by questioning. It's not an
Mm.
answer to it, right? So
Mm.
it's very open ended on your account. Sorry, this is failing to turn into a question. I'm really just trying to describe, but I
That's
mean, if
okay.
you maybe would you like to speak to that, Milad? Would be
I'd love to. No, I think I absolutely. If I get you correctly, I think I understand what you're absolutely saying, and correctly so. I think it's an open-ended question, and again, intendedly so, because I dare not answer the question of what is Islam. I mean, it's just not academically, it's just not good form. But even even in terms of trying to explain Islam on behalf of, a living tradition is probably fraught with all kinds of problems in itself. Of course, we can each of us take a position on what we think Islam is, and many opinions fly around, being from within or without the tradition. Um, but obviously, it's been my preoccupation to study it and teach it, and of course, a privilege to be able to do so and to hold the position I do. Um, but I've always looked at Islam in the broader scheme of religious studies. So, trained as a religious studies scholar, for me, Islam is the topic of discussion and analysis, and of course, and I treat it like I would any other religion that I would be studying. So, not giving it any particular kind of special treatment or anything like that. But the question of being and Martin Heidegger is important to me because, and admittedly, I'm not a Heidegger specialist, and it's not, like he's not my guy in the sense of that I know everything about him in and out, but he's certainly a thinker who has attracted me ever since undergraduate studies, and I've always been drawn to his writings and sat with his, um, you know, pondering questions and just reflecting on them for a long time. So he's kind of, in a way, part of my thinking. Um, but here in this specific space, I use him to kind of overlay some of those questions as a template over asking questions about Islam. So the kind of questions that he would ask to probe um, the philosophical tradition when he sort of gets into the specifics of looking at particular figures, I kind of try and do the same thing with Islam. And of course, as you say, like we're questioning beings, and as he says, Dasein, his word for, I guess, broadly speaking, human beings, is the creature that asks the question, the questions itself, the questions existence. And so that in itself is very, very interesting to me. And so why are we not? So the question for me when in the outset of writing this book was why are we not asking the question of what is Islam, and not in a way of, say, famously a book written by and posthumously published, the book written by Shahab Ahmed, the Pakistani American scholar whose life was tragically cut short because of a malicious cancer that he had. And but fortunately for us, he was able to finish the final draft of this book called "What is Islam?" And I believe the subtitle is, I don't have it here with me. The subtitle is "The Importance of Being Islamic," something along these lines, if I'm not mistaken. And what is Islam became kind of a thing. I think this question um, became a phenomenon after the publication of this book, and then so everyone started talking about it and reading. It's a thick book. And it covers, wow, it's incredibly erudite. And he wrote beautifully, and it's a massive book to get through. But yeah, he's kind of in a way, it reminds me of the conversation we had about Foucault. Like you said, Foucault was an archivist, and in a way, Ahmad was a brilliant archivist in the sense that he kept massive records on various things, which he then kind of pulled together to make this broad analysis in his book. And he's asking the question, what is Islam? But I think to be critical of that work in a sense, but not in a bad way, just in the sense that he's kind of the question asked is to kind of get at something that I think is there. But the way I'm asking it is more like, I guess, in the Heideggerian sense of asking the question about a thing that I don't think that we can necessarily answer or arrive at. Or at least that's my presumption.
Yeah. And yeah, certainly not I guess in language we'd say, and the yeah. So because I think we can define your approach in that way that it's like I did before. I mean, it's an open ended. It's
Yeah.
there's an openness there, and um, it's also the case. I mean, you said mentioned before, you're approaching it as you would any religion, but the approach you have again,
Mm,
it's brilliant in this way too. It's related to what I was saying before, but this Heideggerian approach, it allows you to kind of to get inside without you're not criticizing Islam from without.
mm,
It's the analysis attempts to enter into Islam,
mm,
but without fully taking the step of simply having
mm.
an Islamic approach. So
Right. Yep.
it's so we, so
Mm,
it's neither outside nor entirely inside,
mm,
because you're trying to enter into what Islam actually authentically is. That's the question. Like,
mm.
what really is it in a sympathetic way? I think it's not.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's, as I say, it's a brilliant methodology from that point of view. But it does seem to me though that if because described in this way, it might seem an I was about to say a little bit weak. I mean, actually, weak is a
Hmm.
word I take it following Joni Vatamo. You'd probably positively describe, and I think, and
Absolutely.
I would certainly be sympathetic with that. That actually, this is the deliberately weak approach, right? Strong approaches are ones which you'll try and like force the object, and so I mean, Vatamo, another Heideggerian,
Mm.
famously advocated weak versions of things, and yeah, that's definitely the spirit you approach it. So
Yeah.
not weak in a pejorative sense, but like
No.
weak in a kind of positive sense.
Yeah.
But um, but it might sound like from what is described so far that I mean what can one really say? But actually, I think in some ways, although you're not trying to you're not reaching nor even trying to push for a formal determinate answer to the question of Islam. Nonetheless, there are particular tendencies here which you are pushing in, which
Mm,
I think are quite determinate.
mm,
And I think one, and as I said before, in relation to Sufism, that Sufism is not a major interlocutor for you in this
mm,
book, but I take it. I mean, I think it would be fair, but I mean, feel free to argue with me
mhm,
to say that the tendency here is much more um, towards the kind of Islam that is mystical, spiritual, rather than legalistic, um, in a certain sense, fundamentalist. Uh, and the idea is precisely that is the authenticity of Islam, or that it goes in those directions. And I think although you're not being vituperative in this way, and I'm sorry if I'm trying to force you into this mode, but I think that what you're doing is against um the more severe readings of what Islam is that have been propagated by soi-disant Muslims in recent decades, and become very prominent
mm.
both within Islam and kind of a face of Islam to people outside of it. Does that
Mm.
sound fair to you, Milad?
Yeah, first of all, you're very kind in everything that you say about the book and what I'm trying to do. So I appreciate that. You're really helping me out here. Um, I think it's fair. My my honest answer would be that I wanted to. I'll talk about the relationship to Sufism in a minute, but I wanted to I wanted to at the same time confront not only my own fears, but I guess everyone's trepidation about Islam in certain manifestations that are frightening, that are terrifying, that are, in their cause and in their being, they are designed to strike terror. So that said, there is the uncomfortable question about Islam, as you alluded to earlier, being violent or peaceful, or what is exactly the situation, and how are we to understand Islam in that regard, because it carries this kind of um, element which is often either ignored, glossed over, or you know people just kind of leave it alone. So in a way, I wanted to sort of confront that. I wanted to confront that both within myself, in as a thinker of the subject, but also at the same time help who was reading the book to kind of walk through these issues, as uncomfortable as they are, but nevertheless necessary, I think. Um, so first thing I should say, in terms of Sufism, I think there is, I mean, I can't, in a way also, I can't help. The Sufi thing is always being my area of specialization, it's hard to escape. I know far too many, I'm just way too familiar with Sufi poetry and literature and history on that front. Um, the gravity of that is so powerful. And in a way, I have to say, and perhaps this is my bias, but um, it would be fair to say that Sufism, emerging from the middle of the ninth century, there's still debate about when does Sufism exactly emerge, etc., and what defines Sufism per se. And we won't get into that. This is not a podcast about Sufism, but um, I mean, this is not an episode about Sufism. It emerges, let's just say, for argument's sake, in the middle of the ninth century, and then sort of it becomes prominent quite quickly within the first 3 centuries of Islamic history, and it just kind of, in a way, I would comfortably say it takes over. It becomes the prominent expression of um, Islamic thinking and practice. Islamic, I shouldn't say thinking, Islamic um, religious experience and practice, or praxis. Um, and so it's fair to say it plays a huge role in shaping many aspects of the Muslim world, Muslim civilization, um, from the the religious to the cultural. So in that sense, there is a way in which one could argue, all right, so there's this sort of almost millennia long impression that's left, and a tradition that still continues, and an interpretation that is still a viable way of looking at Islam. Of course, it's contested. And of course, there are challenges to this from various different um, expressions of Islam that exist, such as the Salafi. So Salafi and Sufi dialogue sort of continues. And it's not always in the kind of stark contrast way that we're sort of fed often. So it is subtle and nuanced. Um, so I think that kind of, in a way, that would be my kind of defense of looking at Sufism, having that influence there. But at the same time, I think um, a lot of these questions about how Islam is meant to be, and I think this is a problematic question. How is something meant to be? You know, how is it meant to be? How is it ought to be? Because it presupposes, in a sense, that it was a certain way, but maybe it got lost along the way, and then it's meant to kind of return to that and then continue that sort of form. Was Sufism, was Islam meant to be Sufi-esque or Sufi-like, if you like? Was Muhammad um, endowed with these kind of qualities that the Sufis talk about and define themselves, describe themselves? Um, or is there something that's kind of left out here in this kind of filtering of Islam, and then sort of developing a tradition that is mystical, softer, weaker, to use the words of Fatima. Um, so this question, yeah, it's just hanging over our heads, and hanging over the heads of anyone, the head of anyone investigating the early history of Islam, wanting to look into further um, the origins and the rise of Islam. Sorry, bit of a ramble.
No, no, that's absolutely what I was calling for. I mean, yeah, take there's an important point here to kind of we're not doing a Sufi episode because I mean, I take it from your point of view. This is, and I'm very I really understand um, this in terms of my own work and trying to not write about Foucault.
Mhm.
But I feel like this is an attempt not to write about Sufism. I think there's
Yeah.
because Sufism,
Mhm.
you could be putting Sufism on every page of this book, but then
Oh
you'd
yeah.
have, you've written 3 books, I think, on Sufism, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so then you just have another book on Sufism, and you want not to have that. But it's yeah, it's something that yeah, maybe we can bracket it.
Yeah.
But I feel, I mean, this maybe there's a little bit of critical pressure in this question. I don't really intend it that way. It's more just about me reading the book. Because there's a couple of figures here you mention
Right.
as who I think are important, and I think in a way then play the kind of role that Sufism might if this book was about Sufism. So
Okay.
the 2 figures I'm now struggling to remember exactly their names.
Is Taha one of them?
Yeah, Taha's one of them, and Ibn Khaldun is the
Ibn
name.
Khaldun, yeah.
Yeah, is the other one. So Taha's a very obviously recent figure, like
Hmm.
within our lifetimes
Yes.
in Sudan, who I mean, in both the case of these figures, like in terms of the book, you initially discussed them in what I struck me as quite a neutral way. I mean, it's just like, okay, here is a figure within Islam. What does this tell us? So,
Mm.
with Taha, it's like, okay, this is someone who's almost outside of Islam. They're pushing Islam to the edge. And I think, if I remember correctly, what you say is, well, but that is what hermeneutics is about. I mean, hermeneutics here. I mean, there's some discussion of Gadamer, I think, in the book. I mean, hermeneutics,
Mm.
is something that also begins in Heidegger, right? Modern hermeneutics. I mean, obviously, it has a longer history in terms of biblical criticism or whatever, and
Yes.
in Western thought. But Heidegger is really attached to that notion. So this idea of the hermeneutic circle and what you're doing in this book, it's hermeneutical in this sense, right? But
Yes.
so and Tah's also doing this, right?
Yes.
He is approaching the Quran
Yes.
specifically, right, in a hermeneutical way to say, well, what is the real meaning of this text? Now,
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that has clearly a much longer history in Islam, and I
Yeah.
think it really, I mean, I should say this. It's very
Mm.
obvious. I mean, you kind of made an apology before about stuff that's not in the book, but I mean, you know, if you mentioned everything that needed to be mentioned in a book about Islam that is possibly relevant, this would just you'd spend the rest of your life and it would be 18 volumes and so on, right? So, like, obviously you have to make these exclusions, but but yeah, it seems to me that there's the basic gesture of time. I mean, schematically, the gesture is, of course, to with as I understand it from your description of him, it's quite black and white. It's like, well, okay, so the Meccan verses are the ones we need to follow, and the Medinan ones are
Mm.
basically historical artifacts that don't tell us very much.
Mm.
And of course, this is in opposition to the Sharia law, which he was living under in Sudan, and which ultimately killed him as an apostate. Right? That said, oh no, we just need to do things exactly the way Muhammad did them in Medina
Right.
in the 7th century. Right? And so it's very much against that. But this, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the history of Islam, one way or another,
Mm.
the basic urge here, and we can connect it to Sufism, but I think not only to Sufism, to a whole bunch of tendencies in Islam. I mean, the thing that really actually I kept thinking about is the Ismailis actually with this, but the tendency to go, okay, here we're going to read the Quran not as a literal list. We're going to read it for its deep spiritual content
Yeah.
and the meaning behind it. And I take it that's one form of what Tar's doing. But yeah. So maybe I'll just
No, 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 you're right.
ask that question.
I think that's a great it's a great question. Thank you for that. Um, Taha is an incredibly significant figure to my mind of the 20th century in terms of Islamic figures who are not only equipped with intellectual ability to sort of debate, write, discuss hermeneutically, but also in terms of his own life and practice. So he was an activist in Sudan. Obviously, he had a significant following, one could say, and still does have people who follow his teachings. Um, in fact, and Naim, his famous, I guess, his most famous disciple, student, who's professor at Syracuse, if I'm not mistaken, has kind of taken up the sort of project of Taha's message, but gone into this kind of legalistic world. So he has uh, expertise in law, so he's talking about it within the realm of Islamic law. So he's really, I guess, applying Taha's message in a more concrete way. Um, so in terms of Taha hermeneutics, there's a great Sufi influence there, of course, with Taha. Um, he's a reflective person. He goes into isolation. He comes out of isolation. He has this kind of life transformation, and he begins his work that sort of defines him and takes him to the point of the end that you mentioned. Um, and I think I utilize Taha, um, and I think he's tremendously important to underline, to note, to bring out, bring to the foreground, um, because he asks he he enters into this difficult discussion of, again, what is Islam? But his answer is that Islam. His answer is very clear, and I think he has got a very direct point to make, which is that it's what Muhammad was teaching, preaching, the Muhammad's mission in Mecca. So during this period, he divides the Quran essentially into two um, two lots of verses, each of them with their sort of origin in either Mecca or Medina. And more or less, one can sort of tell when you read these verses that they have a more Medinan bent to them or a more Meccan bent. And the basic distinction that Taha makes is that the Meccan verses are um, defined by their quality of spirituality and uh, spirituality essentially. I mean, the ethical and spiritual verses, I think he says, and the Medinan verses are more legalistic, because they're essentially about how to govern an Islamic state, world, polis. Um, I think polis is a bit too much. It's not a city, but it's governing governance. It's questions about governance, how religion applies to managing a larger community of people. Um, so that entails his what he calls the second message of Islam. And it's a bit confusing if you're following what the second message is, and so what's the first message. Um, uh, the second message of Islam is essentially the return to the first message, to the Meccan verses. So, and to kind of bracket out the Medinan period as you said as a historical um, uh, I I reluctantly say accident, but in historical accident in the sense, well, it had to happen, but it happened for certain reasons, and those reasons are no longer, he says, reasons that concern us today, and today Muslims, it's hugely controversial um, on behalf of Taha that he's arguing that today Muslims can rise above the legalistic. um, sort of narrow interpretation of Islam and begin their approach to the higher, he calls higher Islam, and that kind of ideal Islam, which is bigger and more complex and requires a lifetime to understand through practice and living a life that is spiritual and ethical and so on and so forth. So, um, yeah,
Yeah. No, that's a really helpful précis of what you said with what Taz doing, which and I feel quite remiss for not saying some of that stuff myself when
oh,
posing
that's
the
okay.
question, because
Yeah.
I've not accounting for the readers having not read your the listeners not having read your book. But because the point that I mean, obviously, it's tremendously interesting in itself, but there seemed to be a point later in the book. As I said initially, this is a kind of description. Okay, here's a kind of limit case of Islam pushing it to the edge,
Mhm.
and it's not quite a case of you doing something as simplistic as just saying Taha's right or something like that.
Mm.
However, at a certain point, I think I find you to be thinking with Taha. So you kind of, maybe I'm misreading it, but yeah, your at least your interpretation of Islam or your hermeneutics aligns, if not completely, at least quite closely with what Taha's doing in an attempt to get to this kind of what you call, I think, fundamental Islam.
Right. Yeah, fundamental Islam is is wow. Yeah. Initially, I wanted to call the book Fundamental Islam, actually, point blank. And my point was that, well, this is kind of playing on Heidegger's fundamental ontology. And I wanted to basically say, look, there are fundamentals that we need to acknowledge. And there is a fundamental Islam, and that fundamental Islam kind of goes a little bit like this. But of course, what happens in the process of history and people engaging um, in a living tradition and intellectuals, pondering its meaning and theologians further developing ideas of practice and belief and dogma within the tradition and the diversification of the tradition and so on and so forth. These are all highly complex stuff. And it sort of was my hope to kind of sort of hit the reader with, okay, this is the fundamental question, this is the fundamental aspect, but yet there are ways in which it has gone in different ways and developed quite interesting and complex ways. Um, I agree and disagree with Taha. I mean, I love reading. I loved reading his book, and I really it kind of it moved me. It obviously made me think tremendously deeply about Islam, um, and it'll probably always stay with me. But I especially thought that he did something very unique in the world of Islamic intellectual history, which I think hasn't quite been done. So for me, he's a unique figure. He's a unique thinker. Um, and this question of, the hermeneutics of the Quran for him, that sort of division of the spiritual, ethical, and the legalistic ritual um, types of Islam, categories of Islam, which he engages, um, is in a way helpful. Um, you probably know that there's in the scholarship of so Montgomery Watt, the famous Orientalist Islamicist, who wrote some incredible books himself on Islam. But he had two in particular, one titled Muhammad in Mecca, one Muhammad in Medina. And this follows the same schema of dividing the two missions and explaining Muhammad as having followed two different kind of processes here because of the context and the necessities of his mission overall. Um, but Taha kind of what I disagree with Taha about is, and I kind of don't follow his line of thinking in the way that he interprets the Quran and Islam ultimately, is that I don't necessarily want to say that, Islam is any particular way and that there is an ideal Islam and that there is a lower Islam, if you like, a higher Islam, lower Islam, an ideal Islam, a sort of worldly Islam, or whatever, sort of historical, accidental Islam, and then there's this sort of meta Islam. Um, I kind of find that a little bit difficult, but I understand why he does that, and I understand that that was kind of um, his way of getting around the problem that presents anyone um, who wants to advocate for a purely ethical, spiritual view of Islam, but then has to sort of confront and address the other more difficult aspects of the Quran that talk about certain things that are uncomfortable, um, that are of a legal nature, that are of, you know, ritualistic nature. So he sort of made life simpler in a way of thinking about it. It's like, okay, look, that was just by necessity what had to happen. And now, look, we can, we're in the 20th century modern world. We don't need to do those sort of things. And Islam isn't necessary. Essentially, Islam is not that. So his argument that essentially Islam is something spiritual, ethical, I in part agree with, but it still leaves the problem of um, it still leaves the problem. The other, because you have battles, you have violence, you kind of you have to square with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're very clear about this at certain, particularly early in the book, where I think you say, look, Islam's quite particular in this regard. It has a kind of
Mm,
I forget the exact wording, but like it has a mission in the world, even though it's oriented towards the apocalypse and what's beyond
mm,
this world. It nonetheless also paradoxically wants to put the world in order. I think that's the kind of phrasing you use, which Taha, I guess, is trying to ignore that
mm.
aspect or kind of forget about it.
Yeah. So to be unfair to Taha, I'd say he's romanticizing the situation a little bit, or escaping, trying to escape the situation, working around it, sort of circumventing the problems. Um, what I was going to say is, um, hmm, it's just escaped me.
I mean, maybe if I keep talking, it'll come back to you. But I
Mm,
because I mean, what you were saying before just quite logically leads me to come and talk about Ibn Khaldun as well,
mm,
because I think I mean he, as I understand it, I mean he's a bit of a different thinker and he's significantly further back in time um, than Taha, but there's a kind of romanticization that strikes me there.
mm,
Um, I mean, I'm, let's say, less convinced by. I mean, of course, I only know him from your presentation of it, but what he's saying. I mean, if I don't know how accurate my understanding is, but my understanding of his perspective is this idea that Islam is essentially it's a religion of the Bedouin of the deserts, and I mean you get into some really interesting discussion here
mm,
later about kind of barbarism and
mm,
but it's not a civic religion.
mm,
That's Khaldun's position. I mean, it strikes me it kind of comes up against a similar problem we're just outlining with Taha because
mm.
I mean, it goes back to what you said about the polis. I mean, I take it Medina was a polis in a
Yeah.
fairly, I mean, maybe not in the absolute
Yeah.
strictest sense of a Greek
Hmm.
city
Hmm.
state, but it was a city.
Yeah.
And Islam strikes me actually. I mean, here yeah, this is a provocation, I suppose, but Islam strikes me as a peculiarly civic religion. Like
Mm,
quite when I was
mm,
reading that stuff, I was like, yeah, this is the kind of the opposite of what I
mm,
think about Islam. Actually, because Islam, at least that Medinan aspect of it, really comes out of a civic engagement which is lacking in. I mean, I guess maybe you find it in Confucianism or something, but most
mm,
religious
mm,
systems don't have it.
mm. No, you're absolutely right. And what I was going to say is that being in the world and hyphenated as one word in the way that or Heidegger's word, is translated in English, um, is very specifically my intention to demonstrate how civic Islam is, how worldly Islam is, how oriented to the world it is, and how it must be situated in that context in order to be understood properly, fundamentally. Hence my initial title, which the editors didn't like, the publishers didn't like, Fundamental Islam. Um, and and so that's tremendously important. It's hugely significant in terms of the point that I wanted to make. And that's why I guess I call on Ibn Khaldun as a kind of contrast to Taha. And his discussions about the process of the rise of the Islamic civilization, which begins in a kind of Bedouin origins, this kind of um, fundamental source essence, and then it sort of develops into this kind of sedentary lifestyle and luxury and opulence and so on and so forth, and becomes the magnificent Islamic civilization that a lot of people know as the golden age of Islam. Um, and I think he's what I try and do there with Ibn Khaldun is kind of my attempt to get into his thinking a little bit. So in the chapters, in the part that I write about Ibn Khaldun, I'm kind of entering into discourse with him, I guess, in a way, sort of try and get at his thinking and try and understand what he's trying to convey. And I think what I understood from that exercise was essentially that Ibn Khaldun wants to convey the idea that Islam was, I think the way I put it was an interruption of the civic and civil order of life. It sort of comes into the world like a thunderbolt, and then it itself over time, and he's kind of being critical here, over time becomes domesticated, if I can say that, docile, civilized, right? Um, and this is his kind of cycle of civilizations, how civilizations rise and fall. And obviously he's massive in sociology, and many people utilize his thinking there. But for me, it was important to kind of have a thinker who's kind of really wrestled with this question of what is Islam, but in a very different way.
Mhm.
In a way that kind of looked at, well, let's see what it is, right? Here, it's suddenly emerged with this apostle, Rasul, and the message is such, and and then what happens to this? And then how does it go from that, this kind of apocalyptic end of the world kind of, thing to all of a sudden, you know, silk robes and beautiful palaces and, um, you know, etc.
Yeah, yeah,
Art,
yeah.
decorated Qurans and whatnot. How does that happen? And I think his question is tremendously significant even for this time, if we're asking the question of Islam or what is Islam, um, especially in that open-ended way.
It's it's very interesting. I've got a kind of question about this, but it calls because it's obviously not something. I mean, you're talking about Ibn Khaldun in the book, and I haven't read him, and I'm not aware of the discussion of him in sociology. But my understanding, so he's around at the same time as the Timurids, right? So he's
Yes.
so
Yeah.
fairly soon after the Mongols had
Yeah.
gone into the Levant with I mean just destroying basically the
Mm.
classical, I mean, particularly in Baghdad, right? So yeah, so I wonder, does he discuss the Mongols specifically as a kind of metaphor? Or is this, I wonder if this is in his mind somehow, this like, apocalypse that, obviously he's from North Africa himself, right? So
Yeah.
he's not directly in the crucible that experienced this, but like, yeah, the Islamic world having had the shock of the sudden emergence of a barbaric people that smashed it, like I wonder if this somehow causes him to think back. Maybe that's just a thought bubble.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know actually. I can't. I can't really comment on that, I think. Only because, as you said, he's from North Africa. his own life was kind of up and down, and he ends up being in exile. And then there's this kind of legendary um, biographical bit of detail where he is said to have had discussions with Timur um, about life and meaning and purpose and destiny and all this sort of stuff. Sort of the ruler and the wise man sort of having this conversation, which is this beautiful um, sort of metaphor in itself. Um, but I think a lot of his thinking is really centered around seeing the decline of the Muslim world. I think this is what's prominent in his thought. I mean, obviously the Mongols didn't directly impact him, but I think the way that he sees the Muslim world in exactly where he is in time is that it's on a decline. So it has this kind of Oswald Spengler sense of decline of the West. It's just like decline of the Muslim world. He's kind of, I don't know, maybe a bit depressed about it. And he's just kind of pondering why why this magnificent civilization is going down.
Mm.
And then the reasons for it. I think, and I may be wrong here, but I'll go out on a limb here. I think it might be fair to say that he puts the blame squarely on the fact of it's moving away from its fundamental origins, from that barbaric in quotation mark, that sort of raw um, Bedouin style uh, of Arab life, but also I think by extension the rawness of the message of Islam in that initial phase of fire and brimstone, like God is is real, and repent and be saved, and all this sort of stuff. Time is numbered, um, our time is numbered, and so the imminence of the end and all that sort of stuff. So I think he's if I'm not mistaken, he's putting the fault squarely on the shoulders of that kind of direction towards civilization and civility. And yeah, so
Yeah. No,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. It's really fascinating because but this, I mean, this is a completely idiosyncratic reflection, but yeah,
Mhm.
I hadn't really thought about this before ever. I think but yeah, the perspective from the Islamic world, really for several centuries there, um, before the Turks arrived on the scene and changed things very dramatically, and then you have the rise of the Ottoman Empire, was yeah between the Crusades and the Mongols and the diminishing of Andalus, like it's
Yeah,
like it's all looking like it's going downhill for quite a long period.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and maybe the Turks were the next generation of um, nomadic warriors to come and
Mm,
revitalize Islam, and that's the
absolutely.
answer.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The Turkic age, you could say, is I guess uh the the last phase of the Middle Ages. So sort of the tail end of the Middle Ages, 13th, 14th century, roughly, rise of the Ottomans to the Safavids, 16th century, and then beyond that until the fall, all the rise of, European powers, and the decline of the Muslim world, and the fall of the last Muslim empire, being the Ottoman,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. So, like, you can sort of speak about sort of a moment of rise again, renaissance, and then so again,
Yeah,
speaking again to
no,
Ibn
it's
Khaldun.
it's yeah, but it's also it's very Spenglery in the it's
Yeah,
the same thing happens to the Ottomans. They arrive, then they
yeah,
become more and more,
yeah.
yeah.
Their appeal was very much that kind of return to the origins, return to the source,
Mm.
spirit of Islam, and the sort of moving away from the opulence. Um, yeah, but you would appreciate the sort of the complexity here, or the paradox of this kind of thing. Like, not many people read Ibn Khaldun. Again, it's a the prolegomon is huge in itself, let alone the volumes to get through, and a lot of it is kind of very sort of dry observations he has about everything in life, as you would when you're a you know brilliant um, polymath of the time. But there's this kind of danger, if you like, so that, where you could read him in a way that might vindicate certain monstrous interpretations of Islam in a modern sense, like um, we sort of alluded to earlier. But thankfully, no one has kind of read him enough to kind of utilize Ibn Khaldun. And he doesn't really pop up with that kind of in that kind of way. Obviously, that the name that always pops up in connection to this kind of Islamic violence and sort of political Islam is Sayyid Qutb, obviously. Um, I don't think I mention in the book. No, I
Are
don't mention.
you
Or,
sure? I think you mentioned
or
him
I do.
once.
I do. Yeah.
I think his name was
Yeah.
there. Yeah, like,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
don't think. Yeah,
I couldn't
not. It's not.
resist.
Yeah, no. Well, I think it's. I think it was just in a list of names. I don't think it was
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
focus on Qutb, but
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, yeah. I think because when you're discussing these kind of dangers and so on.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, Qutb. I mean, I take it his. I mean, obviously, he's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or he was
No, he was
involved
involved with
with.
them.
Yeah.
He became kind of convinced by their ideology and joined them.
Mm.
But he was a school teacher. And his work on the Quran, also hermeneutics of the Quran, is really, really interesting. And a part of him that many people don't know about. Many people know the milestones, his kind of manifesto, if you like, in quotation marks, after his sort of shock horror of visiting the States and realizing how hypocritical
Yes. Yeah.
Western societies, etc., etc. He comes back to his home country and he's just like, basically reformed, if you like, or I don't know, somehow
Mm.
it's changed. Um, but what I was going to say is that when you said the danger, yeah. Again, going back to the initial title, and I'm not complaining about this. I love my publisher and I love the new title. I think it's brilliant. But fundamental Islam, and I just remember the subtitle. It was the danger of not thinking, something along those lines. And precisely because I had these questions in mind, right? Like reading Ibn Khaldun, right? We're reading him in a certain way. Yes. He concludes certain things. Yes. But the point is that he's thinking. And are we thinking? Or are we just taking things up and running with them? And this is a huge problem. And why, again, I sort of drew on Heidegger and why Heidegger appeals to me tremendously, despite his many flaws and many criticisms of him, etc. And I know he's not in fashion in the West today, but I just love the fact that he sort of really knuckles down on a particular question and just sort of burrows in and sort of takes it inside out and just thinks it over and so on and so forth. So yeah, that was kind of the spirit of it. I mean, I wanted to really make that point that it's important for us to think and reflect on these issues, especially when it comes to Islam, because that is the danger of not doing so.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, and Heidegger he offers like a whole meta account of what thinking is,
Mm,
and yeah, I mean, it's precisely not to just accept these like familiar habits of thought where we go, ah, yes, Islam is this,
mm,
because that is precisely not thinking. Like,
mm,
but there, I mean, it's occurred to me when you're talking about Qurta because there's this I guess issue I could say in Islam. It's something you talk about
mhm.
with the question of the individual's autonomy to interpret Islam or to interpret the Quran, I guess particularly. But
Right.
um, because as you say, the standard in Islam is that you have to have a jurisprudential framework. You
Mm,
can't just as an individual read the Quran and come to your own conclusions. But then also people do that, or perhaps even
mm,
increasingly. And I mean,
mm.
is actually, I mean, this is a side question, but is Qutb an example? Did he belong to a school of jurisprudence, or was he just his interpretation of the Quran was
Wow.
idiosyncratic?
That's a great question. I don't know exactly what school of law he would have subscribed to. I guess I didn't really read him as this kind of jurisprudent figure.
Mm.
Um, I think that he is quite an impressive intellectual in that his exercise of hermeneutics, reading the Quran, interpreting the Quran, and that to a degree is permissible in the sense that it's um it would be wrong of me, and I apologize if I gave that impression. It would be wrong of me to say that Muslims can't read the Quran for themselves, or a Muslim can't read the Quran for him or herself and then decide certain things or interpret um, religious meaning from it. Um, I think that's incredibly encouraged, in particular with reference to certain strong hadith, you know, going back to the lineage of Muhammad, sayings that sort of encourage Muslims to think and to reflect and to study the Quran. Um, because ultimately, that's all that Muslim community is left with is the Quran, according to this famous hadith, the Quran and so, but there are, I guess, certain stipulations, limitations that encourage Muslims to, traditionally at least, who belong to strong traditions, to sort of consult um, their leaders, the scholars of Islam, the sheikhs, the ulema, and to sort of consult them on matters, especially that have a bearing on life decisions, right? So private spirituality is also important in terms of consulting the ulema, but at the same time, other matters require. Yeah, so it's a tricky question, but I think this sort of not to dance around too much and just to give you a bit of a direct answer is really in Islam. I think it's fair to say there is um, a a strong relationship between the community and its learned scholars. So Muslims feel drawn to those scholars whom they are drawn to, who they see as their leaders, and then they sort of um, seek their advice on matters. I, from my knowledge of historical understanding of Islam, I can't say that hermeneutics or studying the religious canon is forbidden in any sense, frowned upon. Um, but I think the tremendous weight of an alim, someone who's a scholar of the religion, is more, carries more than the ordinary person who might offer up an interpretation and say, isn't it so that this verse says this and therefore that. So there are, as a scholar of Islam, when someone becomes a scholar of Islam, there's a kind of there's a tradition of a rounded education where you study jurisprudence, you study Sharia, you study Hadith, you study the Quran, and you kind of have this rounded knowledge, but also you can go into specializations into different things. So certain leaders are seen as experts in different things. So that's kind of my response to that. But I'm not sure where we'll be going with that. But, um,
Um, yeah, no, so that's tremendously interesting to know. So that, like, yeah, it was a really good explanation. I mean, the question is, like, was the relationship with the individual Islam, I guess, is the big overall one.
yeah.
Because my feeling was that there was, I mean, we haven't really talked much about this, but the last part of your main title, The Destiny of Islam.
Oh yeah.
I mean, we have been talking about the destiny of Islam. We just haven't talked about explicitly about that part of the title.
Mm.
And yeah, I think this speaks to it because I think that at least my impression was that the idea of the individual having more autonomy is somehow implicated here.
Oh
Maybe
yeah.
that's a misreading.
Yeah. So that I am, yeah, advocating for some kind of more individualism.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be advocating for. I mean, I think
Mm,
probably if we were going to be less normative about it, maybe
mm.
the but you're diagnosing that this is the current situation, or that
Mm.
this is the tendency that in the modern world that Islam is confronting, much as it confronts. I mean, the last two chapters of the book, I think, are the ones which really, I mean, logically enough, you start with Heidegger and the Destiny of Islam. The last part of the title comes later, and the ecological question is there, obviously, because it's something it's part of something confronting the destiny of humanity. So it also has to be part of the destiny of Islam, and also the question of the position of women in relation to that. Although that's answered, I think, mostly by you in relation to the historic canonical, if I can say that, position of women in Islam. It doesn't really require like a change of emphasis any more, indeed, than the ecological question does, because fundamentally the resources for dealing with ecological problems are there already in Islam.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the modern. I mean, I think we talked about this last time we spoke on the podcast, and obviously individualism is almost synonymous with modernity. And I certainly this, and my impression was, yeah, that this was you recognize this fact in the book, and that there's that the individual in some sense has to have more autonomy now in relation to Islam than heretofore. Maybe I'm
Um, excuse me. Yeah. So now I'm kind of feeling a little bit um, intimidated because last time you sort of made this great point from with the ending of your um, book and the podcast we recorded, that we need to transcend this individualism. And I'm like, yes, yes, that is so good. Absolutely agree, 100%. And look to something greater. And I guess if I follow that, if I follow you on that reading and say, well, yes, I am. Uh, I definitely would support that, and my gut feeling would be that yes, that would be my answer too, in the sense that we uh, need that kind of looking beyond our own selves, um, our own ambitions or whatever desires that we carry, um, wants and so on. But the problem, I guess, and I wasn't, of course, I wasn't thinking. I should have read you before I wrote this, and I wasn't thinking about it in that sense, which you so well define. I was thinking about it more in terms of the problematics of Islam. So in Islam, there is this hugely, obviously, problematic aspect of, how much can a person think for themselves? How much is a person permitted to run with an interpretation? And this kind of debate that exists traditionally, and is part and parcel of the balance of tradition. This is why Islamic tradition overall sort of deals with this successfully, um, in that it manages ijtihad, the principle of interpretation, um, with the principle of taqlid, the principle of imitation. I mean, these are probably not the best translations. Um, this is far more nuanced, but we won't go there. Basically, this kind of interpretation versus imitation, or following versus to what degree do you follow, to what degree do you think for yourself? Let's put it in our own terms. Um, and that's what I was kind of wrestling with. And I think um, what's that balance has been a little bit out of harmony, and more in favor of following. Now, each tradition and religion is different, and we'll have to talk about, say, that issue in the Christian context or in the Jewish context differently, I would say, to Islam. I think Islam is a different case in that regard. Islam doesn't have, for instance, a central authority, right? Like a papa or a central institution, right?
I mean, what about? Sorry to interject,
No, go for it.
but that's, I mean, that's true of Sunni Islam.
Mm.
but that's not true of it's not true of 7 or 12 Shiism, I think, depending which.
Yes.
So, but yeah,
But the debate is always kind of retort from Muslims often is when I sort of make that argument, what about, say, for example, the highest um, Alem, the Ayatollah, or what about the Aga Khan, the head of the Ismaili? And I think Ismailism is in itself a special case, and I'm not an expert at all in that area, but I think it's a fascinating um, one. But if we sort of go with the two kind of popular traditions, I don't mean popular as in I don't mean to demean the
but
traditions.
you mean that has the
The-
most followers, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah.
objectively.
So the Sunni and Shi, 12 are the most prominent expression of it. Um, Therein, yes, in the Shi'i tradition, you have more what is akin to a clergy, but I think the Shi'i themselves are kind of reluctant to sort of treat them as kind of like on par with clergymen in the sense that um, what's the word? In the Christian tradition, the ordained priest has kind of holy powers, if you like, whereas and that's a terrible description, I'm sorry, but in
I'm not wincing at the description, but anyway, like
in the Islamic case, I don't think that stands in the sense that even the highest member of the scholarly community is not endowed with any particular um, powers, though they may be seen as being special, um,
mm,
saintly, holy, and so on and so forth, as has been the case
right.
famously with various.
But his because I mean, I'm sorry to keep
Uh,
interjecting because I mean,
That's okay.
but I'm getting some clarity, and I mean, I think
Mm.
because the analogy we and I think drew it quite explicitly before is really with like papal infallibility, which of course is
Yeah.
afflicts the most. I shouldn't say afflicts. That's hopelessly tendentious of me. Is a thing in the most popular, in your sense, version of Christianity, but like not for most versions
Yeah.
of Christianity. But yeah, so but I mean, this goes to the question which we're bracketing of the Aga
Mm.
Khan, because when you had Shia imams who were
Mm.
alive,
Yeah.
then they did have that kind of authority.
They had tremendous
But that
charisma. And
okay,
I
so
love that
even
word.
then not okay.
Yeah, I love that. And I use that kind of borrowing from the Christian context, the charisma. Um, there is incredible dispute, about this. But I was going to say that if one goes sort of to the historical um, point, the Muhammad is seen as he carries this kind of this double title, the Rasul and Nabi, the apostle or messenger, and the prophet. So he's got prophetic role and a apostolic
Apostolic,
role.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, but historically, the idea, I mean, objectively, historically, as much as is possible, obviously debated between Shia and Sunni, um, as much as we can see historically, I mean, upon the death of Muhammad, the man, um, after that, what you have is caliphate, and the office of the caliph is not necessarily a religious one; it's a political one. So, caliph is essentially, fundamentally, the person who is filling in for the absence of the religious figure and governing. So they have a sort of caretaker governance role of the community. Now, interestingly, the phenomenon of the imam emerges, um, and before that, not before that, and c- correspondingly also the phenomenon of the awliya, the saints. So this becomes prominent in Sufism. So certain Sufi figures are seen as saintly and holy, and obviously it goes further than that, and it sort of becomes much more than is perhaps within the strict confines of Islamic interpretation permitted. This is what makes Sufism also very interesting, by the way, and also Ismailism, and even Shiism, and to this extent, right? So it kind of pushes the boundaries and takes it a little bit further, sort of looking at the holy imams and sort of the way that they are glorified and loved um, and followed. So it becomes interestingly problematic, right? So and beautifully so. I mean, in a good way, right? Because it raises all these questions. Like again, what is Islamic here? To go back to Shahab Ahmed, if he's saying the importance of being Islamic, so what is Islamic, and why is that important? What is at stake um, here? Have we gone, at a certain point beyond what is Islamic, or is Islamic something that is evolving, or is it what's happening? You know, I want to just pause for a minute.
Oh, that's so fantastic. I mean, we can see. I'm really seeing in real time what you were talking about before with thinking. I mean,
Mm,
that this is a situation where we're holding open
mm.
these questions. You've frozen for me, Milad. I'm not sure how
Oh,
much of it.
likewise.
Oh, okay,
But I
okay.
can hear you. You're
Okay,
back.
that's your back. Okay, okay.
Yay.
I don't know how that'll. We'll have to check how that goes in the recording, but
That'd be fine.
yeah, sure. It's so far in the
No,
conversation.
it's
Uh,
whatever is destined, my friend.
so indeed, inshallah. Uh, yes. So I'm trying to recover what you were saying before I started dragging you down like various rabbit holes. Then
Oh yeah.
about
Sorry
the
about that.
individual and
Oh yeah,
this
yes,
because
yes,
this
yes, yes.
question of
Yeah,
you were
yeah. I thank you for reminding. I'm sorry to cut you off. Were you
no
apologize?
no I was trying to get us back where we were.
The individual is I was saying it's out of harmony. The balance has fallen in favor of following. And so in the case of Islam, I think because of its origins, because of the nature of how I have come to see Islam, I guess, in spending so much time looking at it historically, um, is that it's sort of in a manner of speaking free from that kind of institutional, centralized, authoritative core that is present in, say, Christian tradition. In a way, it has a little bit more flexibility in that sense, and it has that kind of freedom where the individual and their relationship to God one on one can play a hugely important role um, in the way that Islam is seen and experienced and practiced and lived. Um, and I think I was gesturing towards this kind of forgottenness, if we can use a bit of Heideggerian language, um, and sort of bring that back a little bit and rethink this element, which I think is really important.
No, that's so interesting. I'm just I mean I want to say, when I was reading it, because I had this insight I got through this discussion, which it's quite banal actually, but
Mm,
I always and I'm hesitant to say this a little bit because I don't want to attribute this view to you, but I'm sure you remember 20 years ago, the war on terror, there was a common
yeah.
talking point you heard in the West about Islam, quote, needing a reformation.
Oh yeah.
And I always thought this was so stupid at the time because I was like, well, look, Islam already has all the state. It already has it has something pretty close to sola scriptura in Sunni Islam. It has, it's aniconic, like all these things that happened in the Reformation in Europe, Protestantism, just present from the get go with Islam. So what are you talking about? But
Mm,
actually, I think when I reading your book, I was like, oh no, wait a minute. What they mean is this they mean the priesthood of all believers.
mm,
That's what they mean. They mean because it's actually not about. It's about the and it's weird. It's about the what they want is the like unintended consequences of the Reformation, right?
mm.
They want which is modernity, right?
Yeah.
So I mean here
Yeah.
I'm dangerously close to maybe this is appropriate at this kind of terminal point in the discussion. I mean, it's talking about my own baggage, but um, yeah, I mean, this modern individualism comes out of Protestantism, but actually, in terms of what you're saying, I talk about this balance in Islam. I wonder if you couldn't say something similar about what happened in Christianity in the West, where you have it becomes hopelessly in medieval Roman Catholicism becomes hopelessly authoritarian,
Mm,
and then the reaction to that is Protestantism,
mm,
which somewhat unintentionally just opens the floodgates to like everyone's and increasingly everyone can just make up their own version of religion and obviously there's a few hundred years where that's stalled by civic authorities in Europe, but it really gets going in America where there's no one to tell anyone what to think. But
mm,
yeah, but that is to me that is what I mean. It's not modernity strictly speaking, it's the contemporary world we live in where everyone is like an individual and has to have their own unique identity
mm,
in a way that I think no other society has ever had, and I think that comes out of that. But then, I mean, this gets back to what you're saying about this kind of how uncomfortable it makes your position in the book, having putting it into contact with my book, because I'm being really critical of individualism, and it's perfectly for sure. Like you can with because it's what I'm describing is very particularly, and I'm is very particularly a Western phenomenon. It's
mm,
not a phenomenon but I mean, of course, we now live in a global culture, so we've got to assume that this phenomenon is occurring in the Muslim world. Like
mm.
I shared with you that. I mean, because for weird reasons, but my book has been translated into one other language, and that's Turkish. So
Right,
and
yes.
and I'm pretty confident more people are, or at least as many people reading my book in Turkish now as in
Mm,
English. But
mm,
like it's weird because that book is so about the Western world, and I had to put a preface in. I'm like, well, I don't know what you people are going to, you're going to make of this. I mean, I think if you're like very urban and living in Istanbul, I mean, probably you
mm,
probably vibe on that. But
mm,
Turkish society in general is obviously in a very
mm.
like I guess a lot of the Islamicate world, like there's these kind of urban cores that are very westernized versus rural areas where people are much more traditional and this modern individualism is really running up against traditional values. But yeah, I mean, presumably you're advocating some kind of via media, right? You want some people, you're not advocating like total because total individualism is
Oh
is
no,
very
yeah.
problematic, right? But then it
Yes.
don't want Islam is it's about submission, but to God, not to
Mm.
temporal authority, right?
Yeah, there's this kind of paradoxical, I guess, motif in Islam, if I can put it that way. Um, you don't have the kind of authoritative institution, but you do have a total authority of God. And therein, if anything, lies the great mm, restriction to any Muslim. Like, so beyond that is forbidden. Um, the totality of God is all in all. Um, and so, yeah, I think the individual here has room to maneuver in the Islamic tradition. And to your point, that the the problem really lies with, in the result of modernity with the Western tradition, the European um, tradition, the Catholicism, authoritarian version of that, and the Protestant Reformation against it, and so on, opening the floodgates, as you so rightly said. Um, that problem doesn't exist again, as you correctly noted, in the East so much, even with, I believe, Orthodox Christianity, the Orthodox tradition of the East, the Eastern Christian tradition, and its various Oriental churches, and so on and so forth. Um, because the East is very different in nature. It's a different kind of phenomena. Um, and similarly, Islam, I think, has a lot more affinity with Eastern Christianity in that regard, in the sense that it is more balanced in its approach to how things play out in terms of the individual and authority. So how does the individual relate to authority? And that is a tremendous credit to Islam in a sense. Um, and I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to bring the reader to think about more and more, rather than what we're used to seeing in the news, especially with the noted war on terror that began all this kind of black and white thinking, if we call it, I don't even want to call it thinking. um,
Yeah, that's right. It's
it's a
forgetting.
special term, you know. Um,
Mm. Yeah.
so yeah.
No, this is look. This is really interesting. But this, I mean, you can feel free, like if you need to go or anything
Oh no,
like that.
I'm
But
here.
because there's actually something that really strikes me here
Hmm.
with, and obviously this is, this can't be said of like, the kind of origins of Salafism. Like this isn't what like Wahhab was doing in Saudi Arabia hundreds of
Yeah,
years ago.
yeah,
But in terms of, especially, I mean, you look at the kind of um kids who grow up in England or Germany who then go to fight for ISIS in Syria.
yeah,
I mean, I looked at. I mean, there's kind of there's multiple things going on there, but like there's definitely this kind of extreme like Takfiri Salafism.
mm,
It's a reaction against modernity by people who are encountering modernity, and
yeah,
modern individualism, and they want the black and white, and there's that in fact is an attractor to a certain form of Islam, right? So
mm,
um
mm,
yeah, and I that's my sole thought. But I mean, it's the kind of thought I end the book with, which is like we've got to a perverse point of view where if you really want to be, that's what I said at the end of our last talk, right?
mm,
If you want to be an individual, like a really unique individual in our society, you have to reject the values of individualism because
mm,
otherwise you're just doing what everyone else is doing, which is being an individual. But
exactly.
then, but yeah, like the a certain version of Islam, just like a certain version of Christianity,
Mm.
can be attractive. I mean, it's there's a kind of drive for
Yeah,
certain people towards certainty. So it could be religious, political extremism as well,
right, right.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a mixed bag, in the sense of what it involves, and this is it's an area of study in itself, as you know. Some of my colleagues in political science specialize in this area of, in particular, the role of the masculine. Um, I'm referencing Joshua Roos, for example, my colleague from Deakin. Um, so, you know, and sometimes you find in these studies, and in fact in real life anecdotes, that a lot of these young folk that go overseas to fight or to live in that sort of ideal, that they have in their minds, they find the reality is quite different, and they want to come back. We've had cases of this, people wanting to return, um, and then the government discussing whether or not they should allow them and all this sort of stuff. So that gets interesting. Um, I'm certainly no expert in that area, but I can definitely speak to some of the issues that surround it. Um, you know, with you see, again, as sort of thinking of it and sort of reflecting on Islam historically, I I don't know if it's. I mean, so again, also sort of bringing in your thoughts about individualism. I think it's unfortunately individualism again that's driving them, and they're coming out of one version of individualism, entering another version of individualism. Finding losing and wanting to reject one identity and embracing another identity, which is equally problematic. And therein begs the question about, well, what is again Islamic? Is this um, so individualism? The question of individualism, the way that you problematize it, and the way that I'm sort of problematizing the question of Islamicness or being Islamic, is I think they kind of make an interesting point of conversation in a way. They're kind of being bridged here together as we
yeah.
speak about it.
I
Yeah.
think there's an interesting. This is quite obliquely related, but I mean, there's an interesting paradox here,
Mm.
in your approach, right? Which the practice of these extremists, let's say. I mean, I know
Mm.
because the question of extremism is one of the many things you want to
Of
take
course.
this kind of
Of
deconstructive
course.
approach to, where you go, what is
Yeah.
extreme Islam? But
Mm.
I'm just using this phrase extremism under erasure. This the people who the Takfiris, right? People who want to pronounce takfir against, like all kinds of other Muslims. Basically, the claim that the Islamic State made, that as soon as the Islamic State's fighters enter your country, if you don't join us, you're an infidel.
Yeah.
But presumably, like your approach, like although it's inclusivist in terms of what you count as Islam,
Yeah.
I guess you have to say that also is a version of Islam, even though it paradoxically is one that would absolutely refuse that there's any other version of Islam. Or
I think I don't know who I could sort of, as you said last time, index this thought to. I mean, there is a sort of a theory or philosophy that uh, any version of the thing that exists has some kind of link to has a right, but also a link to an origin point. So there's a reason why it's come about in the first place, and how it continues to justify itself and continues to attract even people. So I don't want to diminish the phenomenon, and I don't want to put it down and put people down who might believe that. Um, all I'm trying to say is that, first of all, that's one version, that's one interpretation, perhaps just as justified as others. Um, and and I think it's important to realize there's um, when it becomes problematic when human beings turn on each other, right? So like our issue essentially is, okay, it's not that a bunch of people said we want to go and we want to live in that corner of the world all by ourselves, leave us alone. No worries. It's that they went and did that and then started attacking other human beings. So that becomes problematic from a humanitarian perspective, from a world global, I don't know,
yeah,
perspective. That's a problem because we don't want to see other human beings hurt, especially by way of in the way of ideology or belief.
yeah.
Um, and that kind of harks back to the Middle Ages and the Crusades and the all of that. And it's just, why is it? And how can you justify? And this is a horrible thought. How can you justify the murder of innocent people? You know, based on
Yeah. Although it
something
was
that you
very,
believe,
yeah, yeah.
right? That's problematic for me. I mean, okay,
Sure,
right?
but that's a very, the, that because this there's some, this is particular case, in the history of Islam, the massacre of all the men in this Jewish
Yes.
tribe by Muhammad. In a way, I think that this actually, one phrase you used, you said there can be no excuse
Mhm.
in the book, but I think this, that it struck me. I feel you probably could excuse it in the sense that this was, well, I guess a bit. Sorry, because
Mhm.
the reason it's couched a problem is, there's a particular thinker you're discussing who's discussing it,
Mhm.
because, like, okay, if it was anyone else doing it, okay, whatever, if this is what happened at the time, but you're dealing with Muhammad. So
Mhm.
Muhammad, it's not, it's, this is a real problem because it's not just any leader of the time who we'd expect to do something like this, but the one who is sent, like, is the prophet.
Yeah.
So the standard ought to be higher. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, it's just, it's a kind of banally historically a fact that this was not considered abnormal until very recently in historical terms, to kill people you defeated in war. Um, it wasn't problematized, if we can put it in those
Mhm.
Foucauldian terms. People didn't. For you, it's a problem. I think most people today would, it's outrageous as soon as people see it. So when you saw it with, and we
Mhm.
saw this with the Islamic States, people, like, who are deliberately recapturing that. They're like, yeah, we're going to do exactly what Muhammad did. We're going to capture some people who don't believe the same thing as us and execute them. And it was absolutely scandalous for the world, right? Because, yeah,
Yes.
from a purely historical perspective, that's scandalous today, but no one would have batted an eyelid
Mhm.
500 years ago.
There is important point of distinction. Obviously, as I sort of point out in the book, it is I call it the dark moment of history. And indeed, the rise of ISIS and everything that's happened is also a very dark moment of history. But I think the reasons for either one is different slightly in the sense that, or significantly, because um, in the case of Muhammad, and that sort of excerpt of history doesn't, to be, just to kind of put this out there, not many books repeat that anymore. It's kind of fallen out, right, or kept out of publications. And this features obviously in the great book of Alfred Guillaume, the author of the Penguin edition of Islam, and that kind of classic book now. I don't think you can even purchase it. I mean, you have to kind of find a copy somewhere, as I did, secondhand. Um, so it sort of has that uncomfortable fact of history there, right? And that's kind of what I loved about it. It's like, wow, okay, here we go. Let's confront something, right? And I don't want to play the role of denying history, changing history, altering history, or any of that sort of thing. So just confronting it. That episode had a lot to do with the course of events in Medina, as you know. Um, and it is not the case that the execution was carried out because of the reasons of unbelief. It was because of treason or payback. If I can draw on Gary Trump's work, my old mentor, this kind of retributive logic that plays a big part here. And as you say, in a way, it's part and parcel of history and prehistory. Payback. You do something to me, I do something back to you in equal force and measure. Right? And in a sense, this is why certain compassionate moves that religious traditions make sort of contrast this and make it more special in a way or different to the ordinary behavior of human beings, tribal nature and behavior of human beings historically as retributive payback. So that is kind of like a slap for a slap, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, very Old Testament sort of thing happening right there. Um, but that was the case of one tribe. The others are sort of told to leave, and they're excommunicated from Medina. This is how Medina becomes, or Yathrib becomes Medina. Medina being short for Medinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. Um, but previously Yathrib, a prosperous oasis, predominantly made so by Jewish communities that lived there, and most of them are sort of excommunicated and they leave because of that episode of betrayal, because they take the side of the Meccans who are attacking Muhammad. And I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form that's it's acceptable or excusable. You know, I'm not taking that position. It is an uncomfortable fact of history that anyone studying Islam would have to face, would have to, you know, just, I don't know,
Yeah.
confront, right? And I try and do that in that part of the book, and bring that to light by way of talking about what's happening today, obviously, in terms of the dangers of not thinking, the dangers of the way that we are. And this kind of goes to your point when we talked about in the last episode about the dangers of talking about the past, the sort of fantasies that we have about the past. You know, there's a lot of fantasy going on today in terms of a lot of these modern extremist, violent Islamist movements. Fantasy, and I mean that like in a sincere way, like not again not putting them down, but just saying like there is this like I would have say a romanticization about a certain ideal society. It's not that different in a sense, right? Sorry, were you going to say something?
Sorry, Milad, I just lost you. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
No, I can't hear you.
Hello?
Now I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry
Where did
about that.
where did you hear me last? That's all
And I
right.
think you're saying the phrase, I'm not putting that. You were just becoming quite animated and when it cut out, like it was.
Yeah, I'm just not I'm not sort of saying yeah, did you hear me about the fantasy part?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
You just
yeah.
said that.
So
Yeah,
it's not I'm not putting them anyone down. I'm not trying to sort of discredit what they believe, but like myself, I held certain views about what I'd like society to look like, and that's my fantasy. Um, but you know, but there's an incredible danger, as you say, and that therein lies the problem with looking at Islam in the past, and that's why I say, how can ask the question about Islam? How how are we going if we're going to commit to something? What is it that we're going to commit to, and how is that going to play out?
yeah,
Right?
yeah. No, look, it's yeah, it's fascinating. And I'm tempted to say though, because this question of because right at the beginning of that, you said, or maybe it was even in previous response, but that you you don't know who to index it to, but your intuition here is that Islam is everything that comes from the same origin point.
Mhm.
But that's really it's intriguing to me because it strikes me that's not the Heideggerian definition that you're working with in the book,
No.
actually, because that's about the being in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you can then also then it was like a second degree. The being in the where, what is the being in the world that belongs to Islam? Well, that comes from the origin point. Um, but yeah, and I mean, the figure who I think I would suggest this is quite close to is Alain Badiou, although,
Okay.
but in a very complicated way, because he has the idea that everything is everything, every truth event there has to be an event, a historical event that grounds everything. So no matter
Mhm.
what they think, if you have an ideology like Marxism, they might think it's scientific, but really it's about a particular
Right.
historical event that they keep looking back to. So you can have all the different varieties, but they always go back to that. And I mean, obviously, that's the case with Muhammad, I guess, is the event, right?
Yep.
In
Yep.
Islam.
Yep.
And as long as you're looking back to that, you potentially could be classified as a Muslim.
Well, here's the pickle. Um, is Muhammad or the revelation? So there's this kind of tension that exists within Islamic studies. I would say serious critical Islamic studies. Um, literature is this point, and it is in a sense a philosophical question. It can be a philosophical question, or explored philosophically at least, but it is of historical nature, and that is what is exactly the event horizon of Islam, the revelation or Muhammad. And there's temptations to answer it one way or the other, but I think if one sits with this question long enough, one realizes how incredibly complex it is and problematic in many ways. But then it also explains a lot of what's happening, what's happened and what's happening right now. How do you, so kind of my point about the individual engaging with the revelation, the Quran, as being important versus the kind of, let's say, blind imitation of the exemplar. So what happened in Muhammad's life overall, right?
Yeah.
That is a, mm, a fraught thing because of the fact that we are not 7th century Arabs. We are moderns in a sense, right? In this context that we exist in, we don't do the same things. We're in a very different world. Um, so, like, if I wanted to live like Heidegger, how would I live? It's just right. It sort of becomes, in a way, a problem in itself, right?
Mm.
Again,
Yeah.
it goes back to this point that you made about fantasies, that the ideals that we want to
Mm.
relive, but how difficult and problematic it is to do so now with all the limitations in place.
Mm.
Yeah. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. Um, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I think we might stop there, Milad. We've been going for quite a long time, but
That's fine.
yeah.
I'm more than happy to carry on if you like, but yeah, we can stop there. Absolutely. have you asked everything you wanted to ask? And did all the
No, that will never happen. But it's no, that's yeah. I mean, we covered an enormous amount of ground.
Mm,
Just so thankful to you for
thank you.
writing the book and for sharing
Mm,
your insights into it. I mean, that for me personally, I mean, I hope anyone who's listened to this to the end is feels that they got something out of it. But for me personally, I mean, it was just so helpful to yeah having read the book to
mhm.
have that extra elucidation. So
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate it.
no,
It's
no problem
my
at all.
pleasure.
Um, well, I guess I'll just stop the recording. Hey?